Hey everyone, in this video I am going to show you exactly how I use my sourdough in a week. And I have another video that shows you my sourdough method that involves no feedings and no discards. And I get a lot of questions on that video, so I thought I would show you how I'm actually using my sourdough starter. However, I'm linking the video right here and also in the description box so you can find it. And sometimes a picture says more than 1,000 words, so I have a printout that you can download for free. The link is also below this video that shows you exactly the cycle of my sourdough starter. If you're new to my channel, my name is Anya. I love sharing our simple homemaking journey and all my sourdough recipes. These are my 2 sourdough starters, and I will explain to you why I have 2 and maybe you even see a difference. The first night I take my whole grain sourdough starter out of the refrigerator. This is not too late in the evening, and I simply add some water to it, and then I take a fork to mix it all up because the sourdough starter is really dry. I described that in my method, what I'm doing there. So I'm just reactivating it, and you can see here that it is still a little bit lumpy, but I'm not super worried about that. And I simply let that sit on my kitchen counter overnight. I don't necessarily cover it very tightly. I just have a lid to, just keep it somewhat covered. And the next morning, really early, when I just get up, I am grinding fresh grains because I am making my whole grain sourdough bread that's more for European style, or actually German style bread. And I am using a mixture of einkorn, spelt, and rye berries for that in my KitchenAid attachment grain mill. And if you're wondering about the recipe, I have that in the box below this video. And once my grain is all ground up, I am simply adding the entire sourdough starter to the flour. And then I add filtered water, and the way I do it is just by feel, so I just mix it up and I just add a little bit over time. If you look at my recipe, you will know that I gave you more exact measurements, and also sometimes it really depends on how fine I grind the flour or not, so I just mix it up. Put a beeswax wrap on top and let that sit until midday, so I'm going about my business during the day. So this is early afternoon, it's maybe 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and I'm checking up on my sourdough here, and it's actually a little firmer than I like. However, at this point I am pinching off some of the dough for my next sourdough starter and set that aside. And I'm simply just adding a little bit more water, and you can see that I'm super flexible and super, like, not making a big fuss and just do whatever I feel like with my sourdough because I'm so comfortable with it. And because this bread will be more of a seeded bread, I am adding some pumpkin seeds and some sunflower seeds. And I'm using a glass loaf pan that I am lining with a parchment paper. And yes, I do reuse my parchment paper if I can. And I just simply fill the dough into the loaf pan and cover it up and let that sit again for a number of hours or until it is visibly risen. And here's how I prepare my sourdough starter for the refrigerator. I just add a lot of flour and mix in the flour so it's super dry and super stiff, and that goes into my refrigerator until I bake my next whole grain bread or something that I'm doing with whole grain flour. Just want to show you, this is later in the evening. I've already gotten into my comfy PJs, and you can see that the bread has risen, and I bake it for about an hour and a half. After about an hour and a half, here's my bread, nice and brown, and I will take that out of the loaf pan. I simply peel the parchment paper away from it. Sometimes because there are some creases, it kind of sticks in there, and then I often put the bread back in the warm oven so that it can cool in the oven. A couple of days later, I take out my white sourdough starter and I do the same process again. I add some water to it to reactivate it. Now, I'm doing this in the morning because I want to use it in the evening, and so you can see that you can either do it the night before or you do it early in the morning, and it doesn't really matter. It just needs some time, some warm temperatures, and some water to become reactivated. So for dinner, we're having pizza, and I simply add the flour to my stand mixer, a little bit of salt, some olive oil, and about a cup of the sourdough starter, not all of it, so I'm leaving some of it in the jar. And then I add some water and I mix that all up and simply knead it on high until it has really well developed and is coming off from the sides of the bowl. And I'll let that rest for anywhere from like an hour, maybe 2 hours, depending on how much time I have. This is the pizza that I made, one of the two. This one has asparagus and goat cheese and sun-dried tomatoes and pine nuts on it, and it was super yummy. So that night, because I did have some sourdough starter left over, I didn't use my entire sourdough starter, I am making my no-knead Artisan style sourdough bread. That could just not be simpler. You just throw together a few ingredients, and I always like to include some ratio of whole grain flours. It's a fairly white bread, but I do a cup of rye berries that I grind up very finely, or sometimes I use spelt grains. If I have wheat berries, I grind those up. And again, the full recipe is linked below. So I'm just adding the sourdough starter, my whole grain flour, and then my white flour. Yeast, and yes, it is a sourdough bread, but yeast cultures are part of the sourdough culture, so I don't feel I'm cheating when I'm adding just a little bit of yeast as insurance that the bread really rises well and gives it a very light and airy texture. And I always like to add some malted barley flour, and you don't have to add this at all. If you don't have it, you can always use a teaspoon or so of sugar, but I feel like the barley malt flour really gives it, it's almost like steroids for your sourdough and for your yeast. And I just knead that up into a very shaggy dough. You can see it's super shaggy, it's super wet. Cover it with my beeswax wrap and let that sit overnight. And then I have a little bit of sourdough starter left over in my jar, and same process here. I add some flour to it and mix it into a very, very dry, stiff dough ball, if you will. Sometimes I sprinkle some more on top, and that goes in the refrigerator until I need it the next time. Next morning when I get up, I look at my sourdough, and it has visibly risen. It's very airy, but it's still very wet and shaggy, so you can't really form a round loaf with it. It does need something to keep it from spreading while you're baking it, and that is why on my stove I already have a big Dutch oven lined with parchment paper. It just makes cleanup such a cinch. You can also oil your cast iron Dutch oven, or any Dutch oven for that matter, and I simply pour that in there. I put my lid on and let that rise while I'm going about my day. So I got a little bit busier than I thought, and I came home later than I thought, and I am thinking that I overproofed this bread a little bit, and the way you can tell is that it is rather flat on top than round. However, it will still come out fine, and I'm baking it at 450 degrees. And here's the bread. You can see it is somewhat flat on top rather than more dome shaped. And I do the same here. I lift it out of the hot cast iron Dutch oven very carefully because it's very hot, 450 degrees. You can see all the steam there. And peel the parchment paper away from it. Now, this one you cannot cut while it is very fresh. So you want to definitely let it cool down until it's only warm to the touch and not hot. This is too hot for me to touch it with my hands, and then you can slice it. And this is how I use my sourdough starter. In a week, you can easily add some other recipes into it, and again, you can always prop up your sourdough starter by adding a little bit more flour and water if you find that you would like to make some sourdough pasta or additional sourdough recipes, sourdough cake, and then you can just use it in a very flexible way. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you are looking for more sourdough recipes, I have an entire playlist that you can watch here. Thank you so much for joining me here in my kitchen, and I'll see you in the next video.